Okay, and welcome to the memory chapter. Now, the memory chapter itself, as I mentioned in the previous learning chapter, is very closely tied to learning itself. Learning and memory, in fact, seem like nearly the same process, but in separate sections of the brain. And consequently, you find a lot of overlap in the underlying structure and functionality of how memory operates and how learning operates. One of the things I focused on in the past chapter on learning was that learning was all about the acquisition of a new behavior or the elimination of an old behavior, and memory was about the retention of that behavior or the acquired information over some period of time, even when you were not consciously aware of it. And that's where we're looking at the current time. To talk about memory, to get that information into some format that is retained over some period of time, it's impossible to talk about it without talking about the acquisition processes or the process of getting information out, or even the loss of information over time, which is somewhat similar to the elimination of responding from the learning chapter. So there is a lot of overlap between learning and memory. In fact, that's exactly why these two chapters are right next to each other. But they will show you in the end the larger grouping of basic factors that control all aspects of psychology. Memory is defined in a very simple way. I suppose it could be defined in a quite a bit more specific biological manner. However, I don't believe that memory is understood well enough to take this decades long general definition of memory, such as this, the preservation of experiences over time, and to change it into some underlying biochemical pathway or some other uh, discussion of underlying biological principles. More and more is known about memory as each decade goes by. However, memory is not completely understood. And I suppose I'm going to wind up saying that just about every topic that we talk about in psychology. There's nothing that really is fully known. There's quite a bit more to learn about, and as a result, the definition for memory still tends to be this very general one: the preservation of experiences over time. And again, take a look at that definition and remind yourself of what I already said about the combination or the relationship between learning and memory. Learning being the acquisition or elimination of response patterns or information. Memory is just the preservation of the information over time. But you still have to talk about how the information gets in and how you get it out. So there's always a reference back to the processes of learning. Now, when psychology got started in 1879, one of the very first researchers that started to address the whole issue of memory was this fella Hermann Ebbinghaus. And Ebbinghaus and the other early psychologists were really primarily concerned with consciousness. That is, more than anything else, the primary goal that early psychology had to, to understand consciousness. But in 1879, 1880s, it was very clear that consciousness was too large of a topic to deal with. And so they started to slice off pieces of consciousness that they could actually work with. One of those components we've seen already, sensation, another part of it, perception, another part of it, learning. Ebbinghaus had gotten long lists of words out of his German dictionary. As he tried to learn the list of words, he would come back the following day to see how much of it he could remember, because he was evaluating to see how much was lost or forgotten over a 24-hour period. Ebbinghaus found that it was difficult to forget the words because he was so familiar with them, right? The words were part of his language, and so the words were simply easy to remember. So consequently, Ebbinghaus comes up with an alternate form of experimental stimulus. That's the nonsense syllable. A nonsense syllable is simply a consonant-vowel consonant combination, like you see here. Uh, and you would refer to them as though they're words. So you refer to them as vath, or maz, or widge, or cug. And that's how you describe them. That is the manner in which the stimuli exist as stimuli for a memory experiment. Now, of course, VAF, MOZ, WIDGE, CUG, those kinds of nonsense syllables, they don't constitute words in the German language or English. Typically, they're not going to be seen in most languages. Of course, there might be an occasional oddball that actually does um, show up in a language like pug instead of cug. Pug, P-U-G, that would be a word in English. It's a name for a type of dog. You simply drop it. Don't use that one because people might have a little bit of familiarity with it. But the purpose of these nonsense syllables is simply that the subject who comes into the experiment has no experience with them. Because they have no experience with them, they are basically seeing them for the first time in the experiment, which makes them more easily forgettable because as you're going to wind up seeing, things that are not associated with very many other things tend to be more easily forgotten. And although Ebbinghaus may not have understood that at the time, uh, you certainly see that as the stimulating experiments because try to imagine, memorizing a list of 50 nonsense syllables, which is exactly the kind of thing that Ebbinghaus would do to himself. Learn a list of 50 nonsense syllables on the first day, put the list down, wait 24 hours after the point where you completely learned it, and then try to recall as much of that list as possible. And then do the same thing the second day, the third day, the fourth day, and so on to see how the list is actually forgotten over time and how much is retained, and then to identify the loss over time. The loss over time, as we're going to see, is follows a consistent pattern, which is going to be an exponential loss of information over time. And it won't matter what time scale we work on, information in memory is always lost on an exponential basis. And that's going to be an important point later on because we'll see the mathematics of loss will eventually lead psychologists to refer to the loss in memory as memory decay, simply because exponential loss in memory matches the same mathematical process as exponential loss in radioactive decay. And so memory is referred to as decaying over time because the term decay was borrowed from chemistry. Now, Ebbinghaus did a lot of the uh, grabbing of low-hanging fruit from the knowledge tree. Of course, that's going to be true with anybody who gets started in a field, essentially the first person to get there. And Ebbinghaus referred to memory that we just generically refer to as memory today as savings. This is again kind of a historical point. Nobody refers to memory savings anymore. That's just kind of a historical note of how Ebbinghaus referred to the amount of information or what the information was that was retained. He also examined the rules of relearning. Now, the rules of relearning follow a very standard process that is seen in lots of learning and memory experiments today, and that is if you learn something for the first time, it always takes you the most amount of time on the first time. Right? So the first time you learn something It always takes the maximum duration. Now, if time goes by and you forget the information and you have to relearn it, you will relearn it more rapidly. And if after that second time you learn the information completely, you then wind up forgetting it, and then you come back and have to relearn it again, you will relearn it even more rapidly. And in fact, the rate of relearning speeds up over and over and over again until it essentially looks almost like a phase shift from a point where you don't really know anything, that you get a few reminders, and then boom, you've got all the information back. That process of relearning is actually very common and studied in the field of learning, also in the field of memory itself. So there's, again, it's one of those aspects where you see a lot of overlap between the two fields. Another area that Ebbinghaus evaluated was the spacing effect. Spacing effect also shows up in the field of learning as well. The spacing effect is a process by which the duration in between your attempts to study need to be long enough for your brain to develop a memory of the information you're acquiring, or it will wind up being undermined by trying to be learned too quickly. So the basic rule is you have to have enough time in between study periods for your brain to maximize the amount of memory that is established. But if you squeeze the information too quickly together, that in a way that you generally refer to as cramming information, then you simply don't retain as much information overall. And as you might imagine, this is a very basic effect. You see it in humans and non-humans and learning experiments and memory experiments. And because it's very basic to how memories are acquired, especially the maximizing of the rate at which memories can be formed, this information always shows up in study guides. In fact, when you came to college, you may have actually taken a course on how to study in college. I guarantee if you go back to that book, you will find the spacing effect presented in some way. And in fact, typically in a practical sense, the spacing effect as a general rule, not being specific with particular types of stimuli or individuals, but as a general rule for all people, you are typically expected to study for about 45 to 50 minutes continuously, and then to take the remaining 10 to 15 minutes off as a break. So to work in a 1 hour cycle, okay, 1 hour cycle, study for 45 minutes or 50 minutes, and then take off the remaining 10 or 15 minutes, whichever you do, but work in a 1 hour cycle. And that will maximize the rate at which memories are actually formed. And during that time that you take off, that's great cell phone time, time to do anything other than think about what you had been doing. And the reason why this exists is because there's a number of underlying biological processes that must occur in your brain for a new memory to be formed. However, you don't have any physical feedback system to recognize that they're operating. So for example, if you had to carry weights, if you went to the gym and you were lifting weights, you pick up the weights, you put them down. You pick them up, you put them down. Eventually you start getting tired, and that's feedback in the system. You're wearing your muscles out, you become tired, and you wind up taking a longer break. But when you're doing intellectual work, you can read and read and read and not feel physically fatigued, but you're actually backing up the rate at which your memory is being activated, so that you're exceeding the rate at which your brain can take information in, and you wind up forming memories at a slower rate as a result. So keeping with this 1 hour cycle, 45 minutes and a 15 minutes off, or studying for about 50 minutes and having a 10-minute break, is a very good rule that works across the board with all people for all types of different types of stimuli and so forth. Of course, as you might imagine, this being a psychology class, you could, and you'll do this in later semesters if you take a memory course, you'll see slight variations in the stimuli you're working with and the manner in which they're presented to modify that general 1 hour rule. Now, what we're going to move on to now is the most basic underlying model of memory that you'll see as an undergraduate. That is, there are multiple models of memory that exist in the field of psychology. However, one model tends to dominate all of the other models at the current time. And by and large, this is the only model of memory that you'll actually see as an undergraduate. If you go into a graduate program and study memory specifically, that's probably where you'll see a lot more um, actual theoretical debates regarding different types of memory systems. But this system itself, which was actually developed around the 1960s, maybe the early 70s, and it was not actually all in one time. It kind of developed over the course of a decade or so. Became the primary model that psychologists have relied on ever since. So for about the past 50 years or so, the information processing model of memory has been used. Now, a little bit about the name. Information processing model of memory just sounds like a name for it, but there's actually a little bit of history in there. The term information processing was actually a term from computer science. And during the 1960s, many of the psychologists that were actually working on memory systems were actually comparing the manner in which human memory related metaphorically to the computer systems of the time. So that with a computer system, just like with your laptop today, there's a manner in which you feed information in. Like, so for example, if you're writing a paper for a class, you have to type. Typing is a way to get information in. Then you'll do Control S. That's a saving process. So in some way, the information gets held inside your brain or inside your laptop. And then finally, the third step is that there's going to be a separate process for retrieving the information and pulling it out. And because human memory followed in a metaphorical sense so similarly to a computer system, that psychologists borrowed the term information processing for their model of memory. Now, to be clear, this is actually the second borrowed term that I'm referring to. Information processing is borrowed from computer science because human memory is analogous or metaphorically similar to a computer system. Secondly, the process of memory loss over time is called decay. And it's called decay simply because memory is lost on an exponential basis. And one of the more common processes in science that you see that in which there's loss on an exponential basis is radioactive decay. And because of that similarity, psychologists borrowed the term decay from chemistry and used it to refer to the manner in which information is lost. So we have memory decay from the information processing model, two borrowed terms. Now, to look at the model of memory itself, take a look at it. The model travels or moves from the left to the right. Of course, this is the field of psychology, so as you might imagine, everything gets started with a stimulus, right? Almost nothing, in fact, frankly, starts with a response. Stimuli and response is the two most basic aspects of psychology. everything starts with a stimulus. And from a stimulus, the very first place that the information goes is going to be an area called the sensory register. From the sensory register, the information passes to short-term memory, which we'll see in the entire center section of this model is going to be a essential format for what you refer to as attention. And then from that center section, you'll move on to the final step of the information processing model, which is going to be long-term memory. And then you see here on the bottom, there's going to be a retrieval process to pull information from long-term memory back into your attention or short-term memory. And then we'll look at the way in which information flows through the entire three systems and how it coordinates to form a functioning memory system. So with a stimulus, you go into a sensory register. And of course, you're going to ask yourself, what is a sensory register? You know, I know what a sensory receptor is, but what is a sensory register? A sensory register is essentially the activity of a sensory receptor. And that sensory receptor will generate action potentials beyond the point at which the receptor itself is actually stimulated. And we've actually seen things like that earlier in the semester. In the sensation and perception chapter, one of the places where we saw the overshooting of activity of a sensory receptor was with the opponent process color system. So that, for example, if you're exposed to too much of the color red, the cells that allow you to detect the red color would generate a green after effect. And that's an activity of the receptors themselves that generate a perceptual phenomenon beyond the point at which the red wavelength is actually entering into your eye. Another kind of sensory register process would be if you, for example, in a very simple way, slapped the table that you're sitting in. If you slap the table that you're sitting in, one of the experiences, perceptual experiences you're going to have is a little bit of feeling, probably not pain, but feeling of having slapped the table, at least moments for a few seconds after the point at which your hand is no longer touching the table. That experience of having still felt the slap of the table seconds after it is what is being represented by the term sensory register. Because when you slap the table, of course, pressing on the receptors in your skin will generate action potentials that get fed to your brain so you can experience it, but those receptors will continue to generate action potentials and continue to feed them up through your hand, through your arm, to your spinal cord, and up to the primary location where sense is analyzed in the parietal lobe. And you will have this lengthy or longer period in which information is fed into your brain. Now, consider when you're talking about the sensory register, there are literally tens of millions of receptors that are all generating action potentials at any one time and feeding them into your brain. Right? That is literally tens of millions of inputs into your brain at any one moment. And consider the number of receptors in your eye, which are in the order of millions. Then every single touch receptor in your skin, vibratory receptor in your skin, temperature receptor in your skin, all of the receptors for stretching muscles and tendons inside your body, which give you an ability to locate your body in three-dimensional space. Your hearing, the millions of receptors inside of your cochlea, the receptors inside your nose, the receptors on your tongue, the receptors for balance, all of them, all six of your sensory systems are always active. This has been a basic story that I've told you since chapter 2. Receptors receive sensory input from the environment, and receptors never turn off. It doesn't matter whether you're awake or whether you're asleep. They are always active. When you go unconscious, it's not because your receptors turn off, it's because even though the information is being sent into your brain, there's going to be some other structure in your brain that stops you from paying attention to or responding to these stimuli. And that's going to be the part of the process that leads to a subconscious, or excuse me, I should say unconscious activity, like when you go to sleep. But it is not because the sensory receptors themselves turn off. Now, with all this information being fed into your brain, you might imagine that it would be actually very difficult for your brain to keep up with it all. And in fact, much of it is actually completely irrelevant. Like, for example, in the past chapter in Learning, we talked about how everything that occurs is always associated with everything else that's occurring at the same time. That's what learning is. It's a process of associations. And because you have 6 sensory systems operating at any one time, all 6 sensory systems are being associated with each other in all possible combinations at every moment in time. So the temperature of the room you're in and the color of the table you might be using while you're watching this video are going to be associated. Is the temperature of the room and the color of the table a relevant variable that helps you survive and live your life? No, of course not. But it is being associated together. It's not a thing you can stop from being associated together. It's just the way your nervous system operates. It associates everything together. But the information of all of these millions of possibilities, only some small subset of it will actually make it into the next box, the short-term memory system. The parts or the associations that are relevant that make it into short-term memory are the things that you have learned through a feedback mechanism, given the context you're in and all the other variables in the environment, that there is going to be a select subset of things that are going to be relevant at any one time. Most of the other things will not be relevant. For the things that are not relevant, they are going to be lost. That is gone. The sensory register itself, because you're talking about the activity of receptors, it will function on the order of tenths of a second. Okay, the receptor cells themselves, they operate very quickly. You know that an action potential is a very, very brief pulse of electricity. That at a maximum rate you could get 333 of them per second. So the amount of information being fed in to your system that is not relevant will lead to a lot of loss, and that information will not be formed in memories, and it will decay on the order of tenths of a second. So as the information drops, the sensory information will be lost in the order of tenths of a second. And lost means lost. It doesn't mean it's being fed into your subconscious and you're going to be able to get it out through hypnosis. We talked about hypnosis back in the States of Consciousness chapter. Hypnosis is not a way to get information out of some hidden location from your brain, because you know what? You don't have a hidden location of your brain. Okay, that's not a thing. That's an old, outdated, unsubstantiated theoretical idea that still oftentimes floats around society as a relevant aspect of psychological functioning, but it's not. There is no evidence for a subconscious. And this is oftentimes where you see some of these bad myths about psychology cross over with some of the current contemporary models, where people will kind of confuse these old ideas with the actual functional system now. But this process of the sensory registers decaying information on the order of tenths of a second and losing most of it is actually the process that takes place. For the things that do make it from the sensory register to short-term memory, there is an entirely new system operating here. Short-term memory is a part of a memory system that operates generally in the order of about 30 seconds long. I'll say sometimes 30 to 60 seconds. It again does show exponential decay, and in fact, most of the information from short-term memory, the large majority of it, is actually lost in about the first 20 seconds. But there are still some traces upwards of about a minute. They may not be very strong, but it's likely that you can wind up seeing them. So information lost in the sensory register system, lost in the order of tenths of seconds. In the short-term memory system, by about 30 seconds, generically, we'll say, most of the information is actually lost. So for example, if information makes it into short-term memory, this new memory system that has this longer period that holds information, what you wind up seeing is a loss of memory over the course of about 30 seconds, and if you are not rehearsing the information. And that memory can be held in short-term memory indefinitely, provided you repeat it. So, for example, let's suppose I gave you a phone number. And this is a kind of a common example. If somebody gives you a phone number, that string of 7 digits largely just sounds like a string of 7 random numbers that you're given, but you need to get it written down. If you hear a phone number and don't write it down, there's a good chance after about 20 seconds at least one of those numbers will be gone from short-term memory, in which case the phone number is not really very good any longer. Even if you remember the remaining 6, right, you would have an incomplete phone number. And probably in 20 seconds or more, most of that phone number is actually going to be lost. But if you repeat the number to yourself over and over and over again, that's what the process of rehearsal is, repeating the information. And the simplest way to talk about rehearsal is that rehearsal is the process of repeating. And when you repeat the information, you kind of reset the clock for that 30-second decay. And each time you repeat it, you maintain it another 30 seconds. And of course, you can do this indefinitely. If the information is not rehearsed, maybe you start paying attention to something else, or maybe you don't need it anymore because, let's say I give you a phone number, you write it down on a piece of paper. At that point, you don't have to rehearse it to yourself any longer because you have it written down, and so you can just let it go. It'll leave your memory, but when you need the phone number, you'll have the piece of paper with the number written down on it. So the information will be lost from short-term memory simply at a different but longer time span than you saw in sensory register. Rehearsal as a process in the most simple sense, just to clarify kind of how the way it's used, is usually referred to as repeating information. Sure, and that's absolutely correct. A more common way rehearsal is used is in a conversation with another person. So for example, if you and your friend are talking about what had happened in class, your friend says something, you say something about what they said, and then of course they respond to you about what you said, and then you respond based on what they said. We kind of even talked about this in the learning chapter about how you can use the three-term contingency, operant conditioning, to show how each person's response in a conversation is an antecedent to the next response from the other person, and those two three-term contingencies interleave each other. Now that we talk about that same process here in the memory system, that's exactly what is happening in a conversation with another human being. You're exercising your memory. As you and your friend talk about what had happened in class or what happened on a television program, you keep sharing the same information in slightly different ways, maintaining it over time for a lengthy period. And as you talk about the information and retain it in short-term memory for a long enough period of time, it becomes more and more likely that that information will move to the final third box of the information processing model. And that third box is, of course, long-term memory. Long-term memory is where you really don't have to actively practice a memory any longer. In long-term memory, you're going to be able to store the memory and simply move on. Forget about it. There's lots and lots and lots of memory in your brain, most of which you're not activating right now. So, I could ask you, what did you do over your past summer? Right? That's probably not something you had been thinking about. Or where is your car parked? Or how much money do you have in the bank? How much money is in your checking account? Those are all things that you were probably not thinking about just now, but it is information that is stored in your brain. And that's where we really start to see the difference in long-term memory relative to short-term memory, and of course, sensory register. The sensory register was kind of a passing sensory experience which did not involve much thinking. It was largely on the order of sensory experiences. Short-term memory, there is an active rehearsal process where a person uses language to repeat things to themselves, or language with respect to another person to have a conversation to retain information in the short-term memory for a lengthy period of time. After which, if it's held in short-term memory for a long enough period of time, it will then move on to long-term memory. And in long-term memory, it no longer has to be actively rehearsed. The memory is simply stored and retained over a lengthy period of time. It can, of course, when you look at this model, and of course from practical experience, you know, long-term memories can also decay themselves, and they will decay on a much longer scale than short-term memory or sensory registers. Again, to repeat, sensory register has decay on the order of tenths of a second. Short-term memory has memory decay on the order of about 30 seconds, 30 to 60 seconds, right? It's a curvilinear function, so we don't actually have a clear cutoff point for it. And then long-term memory, that could be around for the rest of your life, right? It'll operate on the order of days, months, years, decades, essentially the rest of your life. And in fact, depending upon how the memory is formed, many of the characteristics of the memory themselves, like how emotional or how much emotionality was involved in the memory when it was formed, the likelihood that you have an opportunity to retrieve the memory under similar stimulus conditions, and a wide variety of things that are actually going to be part of this later chapter are all things that will modify the length of time that that long-term memory can retain itself inside of you. But one thing to keep in mind is that these long-term memories, as they are stored and placed somewhere, somehow, not fully understood, somewhere, somehow in your brain, they can be retrieved. And that is kind of the final step in this whole process, the retrieval of information. And that's going to be the process of retrieval is going to be one of the last steps in the entire memory process that we take a look at. So what we're going to wind up saying is three general processes that we're going to look at in more detail later on. The metaphorical components that are similar to a computer system. Encoding information into your memory, the storage of information in your memory, and then the retrieval of information from your memory. Encoding, storage, and retrieval. We will see that those are the three primary components that are related to how a human memory operates. And when I say human memory, frankly, you're going to wind up seeing very similar processes with non-humans as well, although we're going to focus our attention on human beings. There is one last thing about the information processing model which might not be immediately clear when you look at this diagram, but is actually rather shocking when you make the comment this way. Notice that on the bottom of each of these blue boxes, information is lost. In fact, most of the information from the sensory register is actually lost. Only a small portion of it makes it to short-term memory. And all of the information in short-term memory will eventually be lost unless you only think about one thing for the rest of your life. And of course, that's not going to be the case. You're going to move on, change your attention to identify different types of things in the environment that are relevant to pay attention to. And then finally, long-term memories. Long-term memories may be with you for days and years and decades, but eventually some of it may be lost. Some of it may decay at a very slow rate, but it will still decay and it will be gone. So to say that you are forgetting everything about your life at every moment in time is a perfectly accurate statement to make regarding your memory system. And it's important to recognize your memory this way, that all parts of your memory are all being lost at all times. There's no point at which memory is just stored perfectly in a perfectly accurate manner and always accessible to be retrieved back sometime in the future. That simply does not happen. And it's important to recognize this because as you recognize how memory decays over time, we're going to be investigating the various factors that influence why things would decay, how the information itself can be corrupted over time, and how you will experience something today, will wind up believing something different years in the future, and then maybe even forgetting that. And the thing that you remember in the future, you may be absolutely convinced was absolutely true, but will turn out to be partially, if not fully, incorrect. And that's where we're going to wind up seeing what's referred to as a false memory. That oftentimes happen um, uh, as people are kind of reminded incorrectly of events that happened in their life, that they begin to modify the memory that they pull out of long-term memory and then restore a modified version of it so that the memory slowly changes over time until they eventually think something that actually never happened. And we'll deal with that mostly toward the end of the chapter in the section on retrieval and immediately afterward. So all basic processes from memory are essentially shown in this basic diagram. And if you understand this diagram, you'll be able to figure out essentially any question about memory that you have for an exam or for any time somebody who asks you about your knowledge of the memory system because you're a psychology major, and how much information or how to understand memory and how to explain the way in which it operates. Now I have a few questions here that are based off of the information processing model. Where in the information processing model is attention? Well, I'll give you a shot to take a look at that. Pause the movie if you want, and I'll give you the answer in a moment. Okay, the correct answer is E, short-term memory plus rehearsal. The combination of short-term memory plus your rehearsal system constitutes what you generally refer to as attention. And attention is, of course, the word that is synonymous with consciousness. And you know that because that was a primary issue back in the States of Consciousness chapter. When you look at the word consciousness and how it was used starting in 1879, how early psychologists want to study consciousness, but they couldn't do it. So they start to pull out pieces of consciousness to study individually. The study of consciousness started back in the 1880s to get corrupted with metaphysical thinking, non-scientific ideas, and so there was a process of euphemisms. All right, you go from the study of consciousness to the study of awareness, and then later on you go from the study of awareness to the study of attention. When you use the word attention today, it actually comes from largely the study of memory itself. In the processes that we've talked about back in the States of Consciousness chapter, the original attempt was to study consciousness because that was corrupted with metaphysics. The people that were pushing the whole process of scientific studies of consciousness simply switched to the word awareness. And then as the word awareness became corrupted, they switched to the word attention. And you may remember it was around the 1950s that you started to see the word attention connected to consciousness studies. And that's actually a result of the study of memory from, let's say, 1879 up to the 1950s. So for about 70 years or so of continued scientific work that started to develop the basic model that you see here and a recognition of a basic, usable, scientifically derived model of what attention is from a memory model. So short-term memory, which is the information you're holding in what you would generally refer to as attention, how you retain that information for a longer period of time in attention, which is the process of rehearsal, the fact that you can lose information during that period of time, the fact that if you hold it in short-term memory for a long enough period, it will eventually make it into long-term memory. That whole center section of the information processing model essentially constitutes what you generally refer to as attention today. And it's very important as a psychology student to recognize that because the study of attention itself still has a lot of information that involves factors that affect attention, how it operates. We know that at least empirically, and information we've already talked about, that you only have one attentional resource. Why this resource cannot be broken up, how it operates as a single unit, are all questions that are relevant to the study of attention, and they all come directly from the original study of memory itself. So where is attention? Attention, or what you call attention, is essentially the very center of the information processing model. It's rehearsal and short-term memory on the order of about a 30-second decay process. And the next question, without rehearsal, new events in short-term memory would last about how long? The answer there is, pause it if you want to think about it. And the correct answer is about 30 to 60 seconds. By the way, how would you actually know that information is held that long? There's actually a very simple way to do this. If you give a person a list of words to remember, so for example, feed them a word every second for 10 seconds. So that would wind up being 10 words that they're given. And then as soon as they're given that 10th word, 1 second later, give them a separate task that they have to actively engage their attention for. So for example, you could tell them they have to start counting backwards from 352 by sevens. Now they just were given 10 words, maybe 10 words of grocery items, bread, butter, peas, milk, so forth, whatever it might be. And then you give them a number and say, start counting backwards by sevens from 352. And as they start focusing their attention on counting backwards by sevens, those 10 grocery items will start to decay in time. And in group studies where you can stop people at different points and evaluate how much they remember over time, you will always see a consistent uh, decay across time in which most of the information will actually be lost after about 20 seconds or so, but it may last upwards of about 60 seconds. And that's essentially how you establish that information in short-term memory lasts for a short period of time, because you feed it to a person, then you cause their attention to be activated for something else so they can't purposely rehearse that information in their head. Last question, and this should be a fairly easy one. The terms information processing and decay were borrowed from which areas? And that should be C, computer science and chemistry. Right, the term information processing was originally a computer systems, or a term from the field of computer science back in the 1960s. And the word decay was borrowed from chemistry. And the connection between chemistry and memory is that memory decays on an exponential basis, radiation decays on an exponential basis, and so the common underlying mathematical structure to loss in both senses allows or gave the psychologist reason to borrow the word decay for the field of psychology. Now, where we're at this point is kind of a critical junction. We are on the last chapter before your second exam. And in the learning chapter, as well as this chapter, if you've been looking at the notes ahead of time, you'll see that I have talked about that there are basic fundamental properties that influence all characteristics of psychology. And these are underlying aspects of psychophysics, Gestalt. In fact, they're on the next slide here, so I'm going to hop back, but we saw these back in the learning chapter. Psychophysics, Gestalt, attention, and so forth, everything down there really constitute the basics for all aspects of psychology. None of the parts of these bullet points, none of it ever turns off. They're always active. And you're going to see if they're always active, they're always kind of the basic underlying components that manage all aspects of behavior. Other things that we'll look at later on, for example, like in social psychology, we'll frequently be talking about how people interact with each other, and we'll kind of be dealing with human behavior on a separate level, oftentimes on the order of language, but these principles here still never go away. They are kind of the, and I air quote this, kind of the atomic chemistry of psychology, right? The most basic underlying principles that affect everything, that never turn off. And we're focused on this issue right now because on the slide you're looking at currently, you're looking at a point where we're pulling together a lot of information. In the thought bubble here from the woman, she says, "Oh my God, now I get it. The central nervous system is an input-output system." And remember, that was how the nervous system was described back in chapter 2. There are 6 sensory input systems, and that's the only way to get information into your brain, one of your 6 sensory input systems. And there is a single primary motor output system that leads to neuromuscular junctions that controls your muscles, that allows you to move your body around. So if your central nervous system is an input-output system, and you're looking at this in the context of memory, encoding is going to be the term from memory that refers to any kind of input from any of the 6 sensory input systems. Anything that you experience can be referred to as encoding. and will, of course, pass through the sensory register in your memory system. Then, here we go. When we look at retrieval, getting information out of your brain, that's always going to be the output component. So retrieval, which you would see here in the second to third component, from the third to the second, is information pulled out of long-term memory, and that information had been stored there. So retrieval is always referring to output, the output system of your nervous system, the output pathways from your primary motor cortex out to your muscles. And then finally, memory storage. Memory storage itself occurs through plasticity as an intervening step. Since Chapter 2, I've always referred to your brain's ability to modify itself so that you can establish new memories and form new patterns of behavior. And that is the component where you're actually referring to a long-standing, established change in your nervous system, which constitutes what your long-term memory is. So as you learn something today, your brain changes itself so that tomorrow the new pattern of behavior that you've learned today can be expressed automatically, and that will occur because tomorrow, when the same input reaches your sensory system and feeds into your brain, there will be a separate pathway which will manage that information, reroute the action potentials to the more proper location for output so that your behavior is now changed. Notice that process of memory in this case is working like a functional network of cells that just modify themselves at all times, every day, so that your behavior can always be changed. And in fact, as we're going to wind up seeing in this chapter, a memory is not at all going to be viewed as kind of one molecule, one large protein molecule in your brain someplace, but really a distributed set of cells that form a functional network that simply manage the input into your brain and the location of the specific outputs to manage your behavior. So the entire process is very fluid. It changes constantly. There's nothing ever permanent about your psychological state when you look at it from this standpoint. You are always in a process of change. Now, there may be some things that change very rapidly and other things that change much more slowly, and those will be aspects of separate chapters. When you talk about things that change very quickly, you're oftentimes talking about learning and memory. In fact, even more so learning. But when you're looking at aspects of behavior that are very consistent over time, you're going to wind up seeing that in the personality chapter. Because people that study personality are essentially looking for characteristics of behavior that have very little change over the course of your lifespan. Over the course of your lifespan. And what you're really seeing in a very broad aspect in this case, in a very large arc of understanding psychology, is that you are a living organism which is in constant flux, and some aspects of your behavior change more rapidly, some modestly, and some very, very slowly. But all of it always changes constantly. And that is in a very large aspect of how to understand things, what you really need to grasp. And the sooner you kind of grasp that idea that all your behavior is changing but at different rates, and of course, there'll be some things that change quickly, some things that change slowly, and a long continuum in between, the more you'll actually understand where all the various fields of psychology fit in with each other. So the last comment from this particular slide, again, kind of just refers back to what we were talking about before, encoding, storage, and retrieval. The process of memory which can be understood as the process of just acquiring information, managing it, and getting output to modify your behavior, fits those three very generalized stages. Encoding, getting information in; storage, which is really going to be change structure of your brain activity; and then retrieval, which is always going to be related to the output system.